My name is Nancy Muller, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Tales of Cape Cod. And it's my privilege to welcome you tonight, welcome all of you, what a great crowd, and to introduce our speaker. Please pick up a copy of our 2017 program card so you see what else we'll be featuring for the rest of the season. It's also available on our website, www.talesofcapecod.org. How many of you are first-time attendees? Just excellent, excellent. That young lady in the back there with the white dress on has some applications for membership that she'd be happy to give you on the way out. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Tales of Cape Cod, here is who we are and what we do. Tales of Cape Cod, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and communicating the history of Cape Cod and maintaining this beautiful old colonial courthouse. And it's a 1770s historic building, and preserving the Borden-Who gravesite in Cummaquid. Our speaker series has been operating since 1949. We also conduct reenactments and dramatizations of events that happened around the courthouse. Our sponsor for tonight's presentation is the Barnstable Tavern. Is there anyone here representing the Barnstable Tavern tonight? I'm sorry, Barnstable Market. Anyone here? Well, thank you, Barnstable Market, for sponsoring our program. Tonight's presentation is a birthday celebration of Lizzie Borden. She famously murdered, or did she, her father and stepmother in nearby Fall River, but who was she before that bloody August 1892 morning? And who was she after her trial for murder? Our speaker, Greg Williams, will review the crimes, but also look more closely at the woman, Lizzie Andrew Borden. A little bit about Greg Williams, our speaker. He retired from the bench in 2015. He was a Massachusetts District Court judge for 15 years, for the last 10 as First Justice of Edgartown District Court. Before taking the bench, he was the Deputy Chief of the Western Mass Division of the Attorney General's Office and a private litigator for 18 years. Who better to look at the crime and the defendant, Lizzie Borden? Please save your questions for our speaker until after the presentation, and then join us in the conference room for marvelous desserts. Many thanks to Jude Martin. If you have any comments about tonight's presentation or any ideas for future presentations you'd like to hear, there are some yellow cards in your seat, and just write down, anonymously or not, any information you'd like to give us and drop them in there's a box in the other room. Without further ado, please welcome Greg Williams.
Thank you all for coming. To see so many people here for a subject like this is kind of disturbing. I know that Nancy asked if anybody was here from Barnstable Market, and I kind of got distracted. Was there someone here from Barnstable Market, or no? Well, that's a damn shame, because I was going to be ordering pizza and wine for everybody, but since they're not here, we're starting with audience participation. And you know what that is. Everybody ready?
Yes, ready.
Lizzie Borden took an axe. You said you were ready. Techniques. Gave her father 40 whacks. And she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. There's a second verse, which I know you all know, but I put it up here anyway. Andrew Borden now is dead. Lizzie hit him in the head. Up in heaven he will sing. On the gallows she will swing, but she never did. 1860, between the first Pony Express from Missouri to California and the election to the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, there was a baby born in Fall River. That baby was Lizzie Andrew Borden. She became the most famous or infamous person in the United States because of an event in her house in the summer of 1892. She has remained infamous since. That horrific incident on that August morning, almost exactly 125 years ago, made her a figure of sympathy, terror, and almost immediately kind of a sick joke. You just participated in a black humor chant. And I'm assuming that a good number of you have one of those in your china closet. I know I do. We should ask ourselves why Lizzie Borden as a black humor figure has endured. In other words, why is it okay to eat cake and ice cream in recognition of her birthday? I don't know. That's why you should ask yourself. But I do know that before that August morning, before she became the suspect, the defendant, and the legend, she was a person. Fall River. 1860, Fall River was on its way to becoming the textile capital of the world. Produced 70% of the cotton cloth in the U.S. But the real reason I brought this was because it features the City of Fall River's slogan on it, which, as you can see, is, "We'll try." It's not "Make Fall River Great Again." It's "We'll try." That's a humble enough goal, I think. That year, Andrew Jackson Borden and his wife, Sarah Anthony Morse Borden, were living at 12 Ferry Street in Fall River, which is, you can't really see it too well on that map, but it's a street down here. They were living in that house, which is 59 miles from this building. House no longer exists. In July 1860, Andrew Borden was 37 years old and Sarah was 36 years old. They had been married 15 years. They were married in 1845. This was a two-family home with an attic apartment. And it was common then for several generations of a family to live in the same house. It's not like now, you know, when your kids go to college, they stay away. But then, 1850s, early 1860s, in the house were Abraham Borden, who was Andrew's father, and his second wife, Andrew Borden's two sisters, a brother-in-law, Andrew, Sarah, and their daughter, Emma Lenora Borden. That's actually Sarah there on the right with daughter Emma. There's Emma. There's Emma. And there's Emma again, 19th century, tough. You know. But all these people lived in that same house there. The Bordens had a second daughter whose name was Alice Esther. She was born in 1856. She died at the age of 2 of hydrocephalus, then called dropsy or water on the brain. And then on July 17th, which will be this Wednesday this year, Andrew Borden and Sarah had a third daughter, Lizzie Andrew Borden. They apparently decided to call the baby Lizzie, and so they named her Lizzie. They did not go for Elizabeth. It was Lizzie, and her middle name was Andrew, not Andrews, which appears on the family memorial in Fall River, but her middle name was Andrew. Why was she named Andrew? Some say that her father wanted a son. When Lizzie was 2 years old, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, her mother died of uterine congestion, disease of spine. she was 39 years old. So Andrew was a widower at the age of 40, two daughters, 12-year-old Emma and Lizzie. Emma, whose pictures you just saw a moment ago, had sworn to her mother that she would take care of Lizzie, and she did. And when it was time for Lizzie to attend school, she went to the Morgan Street School, which was severely overcrowded. Still there, Morgan Street School. It was an operating school in Fall River until, I want to say, 8 or 9 years ago. And the name was actually, at that time, something initial Borden, not named after this family, but Borden's a very common name, as you probably know, in Fall River. Anyway, it's still there. That is Lizzie Andrew Borden as a child. That photo was discovered in Swansea in 2008. By the time she was in the 7th grade, the principal of the school knew her family well. Andrew Borden remarried. Again, Borden is an historic Fall River name. So is Durfee and Gray. 1865, Andrew married 37-year-old Abigail, called Abby, Durfee Gray. Andrew, 5'11", he had met the 5'3", 200-pound plus Abby at church. Abby, and then later picture of Abby. This marriage was probably one of convenience, mostly Andrew's. This woman, Abby, could be trusted to be an effective housekeeper and kind of a companion to Andrew and to his two daughters. The principal, back then again, recalled Abby as a kind-hearted woman who tried to win her stepdaughter's love, but without notable success. Neither one of those girls really ever warmed up to Abby. Even so, the household was far from being an unhappy one. By the 7th grade, Lizzie was an average student, neither bright nor dull, and she was said to be subject to varying moods, a trait that she shared with every other human being ever born. A few years later, in 1872, Lizzie Borden was 12 years old, and her father bought the house then numbered 92 2nd Street. Winter. Summer. Now, this house is just over a mile from the Ferry Street house in which Lizzie was born. Andrew bought this house for about $10,000 in money then. Let's call it $189,000, $190,000 today. By then, Andrew was a self-made millionaire. He had started in the furniture business, which quickly morphed into the undertaking business. You see, maybe you don't see how that worked. But if you think about it, furniture, you're building cabinets. You can then build coffins. You need a lot of chairs at wakes. So that's the way that sort of went. And he did very, very well. The rumors about him doing actual undertaking, that is embalming bodies and that kind of thing, those are not true. He did not embalm bodies in the basement of the house and cut their legs off so they could fit the coffins and all that sort of stuff. A lot of rumors like that about him. He wasn't like that at all. But he did well, and he retired at the age of 54. But he then still served on the boards of most of the banks in Fall River and several of the mills and other corporations. Again, let me point out and emphasize, he was a self-made millionaire, multimillionaire. Borden, again, very time-honored name in Fall River. Indeed, Fall River was founded by people named Borden. A lot of people there named Borden, but he was on sort of a distant twig of that family tree and did not inherit or come into a lot of money. To the right of the house that he bought on 2nd Street was a house that was once owned by his uncle, and I love this name, Lodowick, sometimes called Lodwick, but usually L-O-D-O-W-I-C-K. This is the neighborhood that existed then. That's the Borden house. The time I'm speaking of, Uncle Lodewick lived here. A couple of years after Andrew and Sarah were married, Lodewick's wife, who was Andrew's Aunt Eliza, was in the house with her 3 children and the maid. The maid went into the backyard to get some water. Eliza took 2 of the kids, 3-year-old Holden and Eliza, 5 months old. These were Andrew's cousins. Took them into the cellar and drowned them both in the cistern. And then slashed her own throat with a straight razor. So, tough neighborhood. The Borden house was built in 1845, which was the year that Andrew and Sarah were wed. It was a 2-story Greek revival, had 12 rooms and a 3rd-floor attic. There was a 2-story barn in the rear. This was not the slum area that you sometimes hear about. People talk about, oh, the Bordens lived in this kind of run-down neighborhood. It was a pretty solid, diverse neighborhood. By diverse, I mean that there were Catholics living around here. Fall River at that time was pretty stratified. You had the sort of upper strata of society who were Congregationalists. The Catholics were the new people coming into the city to work in the mills. French Canadians, Irish. Some of you may be of one or the other of those heritages. When I say there were Catholics living in the neighborhood, there was living in that house at the time of the events we'll get into in a moment. Whoops. That house was lived in by a family called the Kellys. Gentleman was Irish, of Irish extraction. He was a doctor. This house back here, another doctor, a guy named Dr. Shagnon, French Canadian. So it's okay to be a Catholic living in this neighborhood if you're a doctor. In any event, so that's where they lived. That's where Andrew wanted to live. This neighborhood was very close to what we might call downtown Fall River, what in Fall River is referred to as Down Street. That's what they call the downtown area, very close to South Main Street, in fact. The place to live in Fall River, if you were really of the mercantile aristocracy, or if you thought yourself even above that level, was a place called the Hill. And Andrew had no interest in living on the Hill. He wanted to be close to his downtown, down-street business interests, didn't have any interest in the pretensions of living on the Hill. The house interior, which you will see some pictures of that I took a couple of years ago, is kind of odd, has an odd feel, and the reason for that is there are really no hallways in the house. When you want to go to room B from room A, you walk through the room. There's no hallway, really. There's a little, tiny bit of a hallway upstairs, but that's about it. When the Bordens were living there, all the bedrooms were on the 2nd floor, which was essentially divided in half. Andrew and Abby used the narrow stairs off the kitchen to reach their bedroom, which is that room. These furnishings that are in there now are not original, which is probably just as well. And Lizzie and her sister Emma used the front stairs. Now, Lizzie had at one time the smaller bedroom, but she took a trip to Europe in 1890 that I'll talk a little bit about, and when she got back, she wanted the larger bedroom, and she got it. Emma told her mother that she'd take care of Lizzie, and she did. Now, the houses on 2nd Street were close, all surrounded by wooden fences. They are all gone, except for the Borden house, which you will see there in the center of the picture. That's the Borden house. You might have thought when you figured out who I was to give this talk that you would get a judicial or a jurist view of this case. This is it. Because what has been built across the street from the Borden house is the Fall River Justice Center. That was built in 2010, the new courthouse. There was a football player trial in there a while ago you probably heard about, a guy named Hernandez. But that's what's there now, and if you are sitting as a judge in Fall River District Court and you are in your lobby, we don't use the term chambers in Massachusetts, the term is lobby, and you look out the window, that's what you see. And when you park your car, it's right in there, down here somewhere. So that's what you see out there. So again, all the houses around there are gone. That's the Borden house. It has been a bed and breakfast since August 4th, 1996. Has anybody ever been there? Has anybody ever stayed there? Has anybody stayed in the victim's bedroom for a wedding anniversary? I don't know this woman. Anyway. Could have happened. Teenage Lizzie. After she went through the Morgan Street School, she attended Fall River High School, which was on the hill. And to get into Fall River High School, you had to pass a rigorous entrance exam. And when I say rigorous, I read recently a few of the questions that were asked of people a few years after these events when Lizzie was going to high school, but not too long after that. I couldn't answer any of them. It was, you had to be pretty sharp to get into this place. And this is what it looked like. That's the class of 78, 1878. So despite Andrew's wealth and his positions, Lizzie was not one of Fall River's beautiful people. It might be a good time now to note her so-called spinster status. There is really not a lot of evidence of her romantic attachments except for one. There was a once rumored engagement between Lizzie and a gentleman who lived in Swansea called Orrin Gardner, who was her third cousin. But that went nowhere. So there's not a lot of information about that aspect of her life, if any. And of course, since there wasn't any real hard information about that topic, rumors and innuendo rushed in to fill that void. And one of them was that her tyrannical father, Andrew, kept her so closely and tightly confined that she didn't have a chance to have any suitors come to the house. And the other one was that she was a lesbian. But very confirmed unmarried women were common in Fall River. This was not some weird, oh, she's this weird spinster who lives in this crazy house. There were a lot of women who just didn't get married. And I cannot improve on historians describing these women in Fall River, so this is one of the few quotes here. Like moths to a flame, they were instinctively drawn together, united coven-like by a common bond of unwedded bliss. I love that. That's genius. That really is. I mean, by God, that's historical writing. Now, before passport photographs, physical descriptions sufficed. And Lizzie, again, she's virtually 30 years old. I think she's 29 years and 11 months when she gets this thing. And she was described in this document. She has a medium forehead, straight nose, medium mouth, pointed chin. She had a full face with a light complexion. Her hair was light brown, and her eyes were gray. That could pretty much be anybody from Katy Perry to Nancy Reagan. So I don't know where you're going to go with these descriptions. By the way, the interesting thing in that description, though, was that they described her eyes as gray, not what became icy blue. And it also did not note that she was 5 foot 3 inches tall, just like Abby. That's the ship that they sailed on from Boston to Liverpool. That's the Cunard Line steamship RMS Scythia. Very well-appointed vessel. They left in June 1890. The tour lasted 18 weeks once they got over there. Lizzie loved Europe. She collected 168 high-quality photographs of places that she visited when she was in Europe. She decorated her room with those photographs. She painstakingly filled up 2 photograph albums with those photographs and wrote out these descriptions of the places and included quotes from Hawthorne and Shakespeare and all that kind of thing. She just loved the place. They traveled throughout Great Britain, and she really developed while she was there a love of all things Scottish. They went to the Netherlands, they went to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, and Italy. And this is where I kind of got a little unduly excited, because one of the places that she went to in Italy, and if anybody knows Italian, please forgive my fractured pronunciation, but it is the church, that's not the Italian part, that's English, Church of Santa Maria della Concessione del Cappuccini. Pretty good? It's not like cappuccini. And this is one place in Italy. My family, my wife Mary Ann and my daughter went to Italy a couple of summers ago. And this is the one place I wanted to go. And lo and behold, we stayed in a hotel on the Via Veneto in Rome. And this thing was about 2 blocks down the street. I was just very excited. It's a church. It's a 17th century church. It has a crypt that's from the 18th century. And the crypt is 6 rooms arranged along one side of a walkway about 100 feet long, and 5 of these rooms and the adjacent hallway display human bones. Some of them are complete skeletons still dressed in their Capuchin robes, but some of them are also on the ceiling, and they're arranged. You can see those are all bones. Everything you see there is, except for the white part, ironically. But the other things are all bones, and they're monks. So there are thousands of them, and they're all on display there. So I wanted to see that. And I did. And Lizzie wanted to see it too, apparently, because she went there as well. Other people who have gone there of some fame: Mark Twain, the Marquis de Sade. Great Grand Tour of Europe. Within a couple of weeks of their return to Fall River, the Social Committee of the Young People's Pastoral Aid Society gave a reception for the 3 Miss Bordens who just returned from Europe, and that was done at the Central Congregational Church. This was a big deal, grand affair. They had potted plants, flowers everywhere, the Dyer and Hathaway Orchestra, chicken salad. But that trip apparently did not enhance Lizzie's social position, and that is revealed by the fact that the president of the society escorted the 2 other Borden sisters home, while some guy named Fred finally did the polite thing for Miss Lizzie Borden and escorted her home. Now we're going to get to it. We jump forward to August 3rd, 1892. A few hundred yards down street from the Borden house was D.R. Smith's drugstore. Right there. Clerk there was a guy named Eli Bentz. He told police a couple of days later that a woman he later identified as Lizzie Borden had been there to this drugstore on August 3rd to buy 10 cents worth of prussic acid to clean a sealskin cape. Prussic acid is hydrogen cyanide. Bentz refused to sell it to her. I only want 10 cents worth. I have to clean this cape. Sorry, I'm not selling it to you. She left empty-handed. That evening, same day, Lizzie visited a family friend living around the corner from her house on Borden Street, a woman named Alice Russell. This is Alice Russell. Alice is the reason we still talk about Lizzie. Without Alice, Lizzie is just another citizen of Fall River, probably less well chronicled than most of the people of her class. Lizzie goes to see Alice Russell, who is a 43-year-old widow, and spends about 2 hours unburdening herself onto Alice. She is depressed. She can't throw off this depression that she feels. There's something hanging over her. She thinks somebody might kill her father. She's worried that somebody's going to poison the milk. She's worried that somebody is going to poison the bread. And every time she brings up one of these things, Alice says, that's not going to happen because what about this, what about that, and the other thing? Oh, yeah, but what about the bread? Well, the bread, is made in this place. So she's kind of trying to tamp all this down and trying to quell this worry that Lizzie is pouring out to her. She notes that her father and her stepmother have been sick, thinks they might have been poisoned, thinks somebody might burn the house down. She goes on and on, about 2 hours worth of this stuff. She finally leaves. She gets back to the house on 2nd Street about 9 o'clock in the evening, and she walks in the front door, sails upstairs without greeting her 59-year-old uncle, John Vinicum Morse, who has shown up at the house that day without so much as a toothbrush or a comic book. And he's going to stay there. He's going to spend the night. He's in the sitting room talking with Andrew and Abby, and Lizzie doesn't even say, hi, how you doing? She goes right up the stairs and goes to her room. This is an odd guy. The reason I say that is nobody could really figure out what he was doing there. He certainly discussed business off and on with Andrew, but he doesn't have any luggage, and it's really even hard to figure out where the heck this guy lived. If you read various books and histories about this, some people talk about him living in Dartmouth. Although he lived in the Midwest for quite a while, he had left the area and moved to the Midwest. He had supposedly returned to Dartmouth, but that was unclear. And one of the things this guy tried to pull is he testified at the trial, and of course when you testify at trial sometimes you get witness fees, and he goes down to the place and says he wants his travel for his witness fees. Well, where do you live? And he says, Iowa. I want my travel from Iowa to here. Nice try, pal. You are getting your travel from Dartmouth to here. So, odd guy. Next day, August 4th, 1892, a Thursday. Now, sometimes when you read about this, the first thing that everybody talks about is how ungodly, record-breaking hot it was. It was, 100 degrees by 7:30 in the morning and all this kind of thing. It wasn't. It was hot enough. It was probably, as far as people can extrapolate this backwards, it was probably somewhere 83, 84, 85 degrees, something like that, which is hot enough. As far as I'm concerned, that's 40 degrees too hot. But, it's hot and it's humid, especially when you're running around wearing wool clothing and 500 petticoats all day long. But, so it's hot. August 4th, 1892, by about 8 o'clock in the morning, Andrew, Abby, Uncle Morse start in on the most famous breakfast in murder history, which includes remnants of mutton started the day or two before. This isn't the mutton. It's just a picture of mutton. It's now broth. They've transmogrified this mutton from, mutton to something else, and by now it's broth, and they're eating it for breakfast. Johnny cakes. Everybody know what Johnny cakes are. Cornmeal, flatbread, coffee, cookies. That's good. I like that. Bananas. Lizzie and Emma typically did not eat breakfast with their father and stepmother. They just didn't. And they didn't on this day. As a matter of fact, Emma wasn't even there. She was in Fairhaven. Anybody here from there? Somebody tried to almost raise their hands back then and then thought better of it. Now, Fairhaven's a nice place, but you have to pronounce it correctly. I just said Fairhaven. That is not the way you pronounce it. It is Fairhaven. So, anyway, that's where Emma is. That's about 15 miles away. She's not even in the house. And so all these other people eat breakfast, and then on separate errands, Andrew and Uncle Morse leave the house before 9 o'clock, and shortly thereafter, Lizzie comes downstairs and maybe eats a cookie, drinks a cup of coffee. And now, 9 o'clock, in the house, Abby, Lizzie, and their 26-year-old Irish maid, Bridget Maggie Sullivan. The only reason she's called Maggie is because that's what Lizzie and Emma call her, because they used to have a maid living in the house whose actual name was Maggie. This woman's name is Bridget. To them, she's Maggie. Bridget, like Andrew and Abby, is sick with what is probably something that was then termed summer sickness. And the reason for summer sickness is that you're eating food that is insufficiently fresh or refrigerated. So there had been a brief visit to the doctor the day before, and Abby went running across the street to Dr. Bowen's house. He lived right across the street in a very, very nice duplex where the courthouse is now. And he said, in essence, you're not being poisoned, you have summer sickness, goodbye. You know, you're fine. So that's what's going on, and despite the fact that this poor woman was feeling ill, Abby wanted her to wash all the first floor windows inside and out. And she did that. She's outside, and she talked to the maid at the Kelly household, which was next door to the right. I showed you that earlier. And then she pretty much finished the windows on the outside. Then she went inside to start washing the windows. And at about 10:40, 10:45, somebody is trying to enter the bolted front door of the house, which is right there. That's the front staircase I told you about. This is a dress. Floor right here. That wasn't there. But that gives you sort of an idea of the scale of this place and what the front door looked like. Somebody's trying to get in there. And Andrew had been downtown, running around down street with his various business dealings, including going to the building that still, well, I guess they still call it the A.J. Borden building, but anyway, he was building a building right on South Main Street. I think the Travelers Insurance Company is there now. And he didn't feel well, so he came home early. 10:40, 10:45. So she's knocking on the door. Bridget runs to the front door to try to open it. She's having trouble with the bolt, and she's getting increasingly frustrated at doing that. So she lets out an expletive. I know you didn't come here intending to hear this kind of language, and I apologize. Oh, Shaw. And she hears who she takes to be Lizzie up that front staircase at the top of it, giggling. Now, some historians find that deeply sinister, and other people think she's just giggling because she's seeing this woman get frustrated at trying to open the door. So some things are not freighted with deep meaning. Maybe they are. Either way, as Lizzie stands at the top of that staircase, about 10:45, she was within 15 feet of the bed in the second floor guest room. Now Andrew gets into the house. That's not Mike Pence. It's Andrew Jackson Borden. Closer to the age he was at the time of this incident. He's only 69, by the way. He gets into the house. He asks Lizzie, "Where's Abby?" And Lizzie gives him this story about, somebody, a messenger boy came to the door with a note from a sick friend. I don't know who it was. Didn't see the boy. Don't have the note. But she's gone. She left the house. Okay, fine. Andrew lounges on the sofa in the sitting room. By the way, he does have on a black Prince Albert woolen coat. So 83 degrees, 79 degrees, whatever, he's got that on. And when he gets into the house, he takes that off because he's going to get casual. He puts on another different kind of sport coat, also black. But now he lounges on the sofa, this is not the sofa. This was not there at the time. But this sofa is in the position in the room that it was in on that morning in August 1892. This is the dining room over here. So there he is, and he's lying with his head about where that hatchet is there. And pretty soon thereafter, Bridget, again still feeling ill, she had already been out in the backyard vomiting for 10 minutes, decides that it's now time for her to go upstairs and take a nap. She has a room on in the third floor attic, and she goes up there and she's lying down. Now it's about, say, let's call it 11 o'clock. You've got Andrew lying on the sofa in the first floor sitting room. You've got Bridget lying on her bed in her third floor room, and Abby is lying face down on the rug next to the bed in the second floor guest room, and she had been dead more than an hour. And where was Lizzie? It's my favorite picture of Lizzie. I just threw it in here at this point. The only source of that information, where it was Lizzie, is Lizzie. Now, they had an inquest a few days later, and she testified at that inquest. In fact, she testified parts of 3 days. And her account was a little confusing. Most favorable to her is the following account as to where she was, where she says she was. She said she wandered into the backyard. This is soon after the maid goes upstairs. She wandered into the backyard. That's the back of the house. That's the barn. And by the way, when you saw the present-day pictures, there's a building back there, but it is not the barn that was there in the 1890s. That was torn down in the mid-1920s. But she's wandering around out here, and famously, there are some pear trees out there, and she picks up 2 or 3 windfall pears and is eating those pears. That's what she's doing. She's in the backyard eating pears. Now, given the fact, 2 facts, that Bridget has been out there vomiting, and that's where you throw the contents of the slop jars in the morning, I'd be real careful about eating windfall anything out of this backyard. But she does. So she does that for a while, and then she remembers she's supposed to go fishing on Monday in Marion. So she goes into the loft of that barn looking for lead with which to make sinkers so she can go fishing. That's what she's doing. And 15, 20 minutes later, she's back in the house, a few minutes after 11. And she goes in and she sees her father lying on that sofa, and she perceives that he has been cut, is the word she used. And she called up the back stairs to Bridget/Maggie that someone had come into the... I didn't mean that. Someone had come into the house and killed Father. Maggie rushes downstairs. Lizzie sends her for the doctor. Dr. Bowen, who lives across the street in a duplex. He's not home. She comes back. Go get Alice. Why would you do that? Don't get Alice. Please, don't involve Alice. But she does. And meanwhile, the neighbor to the left side of the house as you face it is another 43-year-old widow named Adelaide Churchill. And she sees... Oh, show you the picture. She's 43. She sees Lizzie at the side door, which is right off the kitchen. That's the way it looked then. And that's the way it looks now. And Lizzie looks upset. She goes over there. Don't have time to get into all the details of the conversation, but it ends up with Addie Churchill, sending her hired man to go get a doctor. And he was down at the stable, which is down the street. She's overheard with that, and pretty soon the police are alerted that something is amiss at the Borden house. Dr. Bowen, who they tried to summon earlier. He soon arrives, and he concludes that Andrew was murdered. He was real murdered. His face was obliterated. He's still losing blood at this point, by the way. His face is said to resemble raw meat. He had 10 generally parallel wounds. The longest was about 4.5 inches long toward the left side of his head and face down to his jaw. One of his eyes was bisected. There was some blood spatter on the floor, that rug there, and on the wall, and there was a picture hanging up there, which is not in this photo, that's got a few blood spots on it. But, as Dr. Bowen later said, nothing to indicate the slaughter that had taken place. People often assume that in murders like this, blood flies everywhere, drenching the killer in gore. And that's just not necessarily true, especially if you don't strike an artery. There's no arterial spray or spurt, and that's what happened here. The carotid wasn't severed or anything like that, so there's some blood flying around a little bit, but not to the extent that you would think. By the way, when I read that phrase, arterial spray, I thought that would be a good name for a rock group. I was too late by almost 10 years. Arterial Spray was a death metal group in Portland, Oregon in 2008. You are unlikely to attend another presentation on the Cape that contains that kind of information. Anyway, so Bowen says, yeah, he's dead, I got that, and the interesting thing about that, and the reason I did dwell on the blood a little bit, is that, given the timing, people see Lizzie very soon after this murder. She is spotless. Her hair's not even out of place. And that's sometimes cited as the main reason why she could not be the killer. She would have had some blood on her. But she also told the police she had been in a hot, dusty barn for 20 minutes. And she didn't like that necessarily happen either. So, anyway, pretty soon. Well, okay, we know where Andrew is. Where is Abby? So, Bridget and Ms. Churchill venture up the front stairs. And from one of the steps, when you go upstairs in those front stairs, you can see under the guest room bed. This is not the same bed, but probably fairly close. There's a woman lying there in this picture. It's not Abby, though. But there is a woman lying there to demonstrate for people who visit the house what you could see when you go up those steps. Bridget went up there first, didn't see anything. Addie goes up there. She glances over at exactly the right or wrong time, depending on your perspective, and she sees something there, and she figures out pretty quickly it is Abby. That's the guest room. That is Abby, which is an interesting angle. And the interesting thing about this picture is the way her feet look. Well, the reason her feet look like that, so I have read, is that when she did these little chores and she was running around the house with a little feather duster around this time, is she just slipped on Andrew's shoes. So she's wearing Andrew's shoes in this picture. Anyway, that's her, and that's her, again, in the spot where she was murdered. She's got about it's a little hard to tell on her, but she's got about 19 wounds. There's one in her back, about 4 inches below her neck. Most of them are on her head, most toward the right side. She had some facial contusions, probably caused by her falling to the floor. But she also had on her forehead what is described as a flap wound. And the significance of that is that she saw who killed her for the first blow. Now, given the congealed blood, some of which you can see there on the rug, and the cooling of her body. The times of death are generally accepted to be about 9:30 for Abby, just after 11 for Andrew. Police are alerted pretty soon. They're swarming the place. They're searching everywhere. They're searching the house. They're searching the yard. They're searching the log pile. They're searching the barn. They're all over the place. And by Friday night, Dr. Bowen has started prescribing to Lizzie mild morphine. And that dose gets doubled on Saturday and is continued for several days. It's hard to know the effect of that drug on her, but the significance of it is that she's testifying at the inquest by about that time. Now, maybe she was affected by the morphine, who knows. Several officers interview her one at a time. She's upstairs with the fan, and all that. Everybody's hovering around her. And the cops are coming in, and they're pretty solicitous for the most part. But they interview her, and at one point, one of the officers says to her, refers to her mother. And Lizzie says, "She was not my mother. She was my stepmother. My mother died when I was a child." Now, we don't know the inflection of her voice when she said that to the police, but I guess it doesn't matter, because just around that time, the police thought, there you go. Won't even call her mother, killed her. It's a pretty big leap, but that's what they kind of focused on. They zeroed in on her right then. The medical examiner, a guy named Dolan, is there by now. He's conducting preliminary exams of Abby's head, Andrew's head. Yeah, they're dead. Somebody hit him in the head with something. And he also, right there in the house, I mean, they've been doing this in the house. They remove their stomachs, tie the stomach up, put them in a stomach jar. I guess medical examiners had stomach jars. And sealed them up, sent them up to Harvard Medical School to have them tested for the presence of poison. There was none. Funeral's on Saturday. It's a brief service. The caskets are in the sitting room, the very room where Andrew was murdered. The procession moved through about 2,500 people out in the street to Oak Grove Cemetery, which is on the hill on Prospect Street. That's the front gate. And the whole thing, the carriages go in there, they take the caskets off the carriages, they move them to the graveside, and then they move them back onto the hearses, and they move them up to a little building, not this one probably, there's another one right over here. And the reason they did that is because the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had ordered further investigation of their bodies. And what that entailed was cutting their heads off. So they did, right there at the cemetery. Cut both of their heads off. No notice to Lizzie, no notice to Emma or anybody else. They did it right there at the cemetery. Cleaned the heads up, boiled all the flesh off of them and everything, as you do, And that is Andrew, and that is Abby. And I heard some gasps in the audience when these pictures were shown. Not sure what you expected to see at a lecture about axe murders. That's it. Now, the police are all over the place. They're still searching. They don't find any bloody clothing. They don't really find a murder weapon. Although one hatchet that they were actually directed to on the orders of Lizzie to Bridget in the basement was this. And the reason they're suspicious of this particular implement is that it looked to them as though it had been made wet and rolled in ashes so that it would look like it was dusty, old, and unused. Plus the handle was broken off, just as you see in this picture. But this was tested, no blood traces in all those little grooves down there, and, pardon me, really where you would expect to see them was up in this area. I don't find anything. Now, the day after the funeral, again, numerous police searches. Remember Alice? Alice had stayed in the house since Thursday night, the day of the murders. And on Sunday morning, Lizzie, Emma, and Alice are in the kitchen, And all of a sudden, Lizzie's standing at the stove. You know how they had one of these big stoves there? And she's tearing up a dress that she's going to burn because it has paint stains on it. And Alice says, you know, don't anybody see you do that, because, you know, the police are still here. They're still running around. They're out in the yard. They could walk in the house at any moment. So don't anybody see you do that. Okay, fine. And then the next day, Alice tells Lizzie that Alice, had been asked about the dress. And she says to Lizzie, that's the worst thing you could have done, was burn that dress. And Lizzie said, well, why didn't you stop me or say something? Now, did Lizzie burn a dress with bloodstains? We'll never know. But, again, this is 4 days later. The police have been over this place, many times. And why haven't they found a bloody dress? Seems like a bloody dress would be one of the top 2 things they want to find. Didn't find one. Lizzie, as I already mentioned, testified at the inquest the following week, and after the 3rd day of her testimony, she is arrested and placed into custody. And she will spend the next 10 months, on and off, because she's got to make court appearances and the like, to Taunton Jail. And she stays in that room right there, with a view of the garden. We're going to zip by several more of the pretrial events until we get to the grand jury in November. That's when the case explodes in Lizzie's face. The standard at a grand jury, as you probably know, is pretty low. Probable cause, you always hear that cliche about anybody could indict a ham sandwich, you know, that kind of stuff. And so it's, you know, it's pretty low. Nevertheless, 6 days of the grand jury proceedings go by and the grand jury is not taking any action. And then Alice, remember Alice? Well, Alice, she starts thinking, you know what, I'm a little suspicious of my old close friend Lizzie. So she goes to her lawyer and asks him what she should do, because she was in the kitchen when that dress was burned. Oh, and also, it was at her house the night before the murders, to which Lizzie had repaired and delivered herself of this fear and depression. Well, the lawyer, not surprisingly, sends her to the district attorney. She goes to the district attorney, and he wants her to testify, and she does testify in front of the grand jury on December 1st, 1892. The grand jury goes out, they deliberate 10 minutes, and come back, and Lizzie is indicted. Alice, thanks for nothing. Russell. Now, there's no trial for 6 months, and it finally starts the following June 5th, 1893. Somewhat helpful to Lizzie right at the beginning of the trial is the fact that 5 days before her trial started, a woman was brutally murdered in her Fall River home by numerous axe blows to the back of her head in her kitchen. A woman named Bertha Manchester. Now, the jury pool probably knew that. They also knew that Lizzie could not possibly have done that because she's been in custody for months. What they didn't know was that the actual assailant, young Azorean immigrant, had been arrested for that crime. Trial, I'll only mention 4 points. Trial's in New Bedford, not Fall River. Still Bristol County, but New Bedford, that's the courtroom. At that time, for capital cases, that is, cases in which you were being tried for a crime for which you could be hanged, they had a 3-judge Superior Court panel. The chief judge is a gentleman named Justin Dewey. Justin Dewey was appointed to the Superior Court 7 years before this trial by Governor George Robinson. At the time of this trial, Robinson was not the governor any longer. He was Lizzie Borden's lead lawyer. He was paid $25,000 to conduct this trial. Let's call it $650,000. No income tax. Not bad. Now, a friend of mine is a partner in a Springfield law firm called Robinson Donovan. It used to be called, years ago, it was called Robinson Donovan, Madden and Berry, now called Robinson Donovan. The Robinson in that law firm's title is this gentleman. And my friend Jeff is the custodian of what are called the Robinson Papers. These papers could include trial notes of this trial made by George Robinson. They could also include trial notes passed to him by his client, Lizzie Borden, during the trial. These papers have never been made public, and they never will be. And the reason for that is that the firm, Robinson Donovan, specifically Jeff, have a Board of Bar Overseers opinion. That's the body that governs the conduct of lawyers in the Commonwealth. Their opinion is that the attorney-client privilege still holds despite the death of the client, Lizzie Borden. Jeff frequently gets calls. He's been called by people in Australia, gets calls all over the place. Just give me a little hint what's in the box. And he turns everyone down, including me. Jury. Male jury. 12 white guys. 3 of these guys have the last name Wilbur, all spelled different ways. That means something. I don't know what. They all had facial hair. It's like a Starbucks in Cambridge. The first women jurors in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, arguably the most liberal state in the country, the first women jurors, 1951. Now, however, back then, the all-male jury might well have worked to Lizzie's advantage. These sturdy, late Victorian era yeomen are unlikely to believe that a genteel woman like the lovely and well-dressed Lizzie Borden hacked a couple of people to death. They're just going to be reluctant about that. And they're further going to be reluctant to send that nice lady to the gallows. So, might have been a good thing for her that all these... I'm not saying that women would have sent her to the gallows, but I'm just saying that their sense of disbelief, maybe even something you might want to call chivalry, was reluctant to convict her. I just throw this in. No woman had been executed in Massachusetts since 1798. A woman named Rachel Wall, who was a pirate, was hanged. I don't think these guys knew that, but, you know, they didn't want to hang this nice lady. This is the part I really go crazy about. Well, not that crazy. Weapon evidence. This is not the murder weapon. But the thing that really puzzles me is that this hatchet head was waved all over the place during this trial, despite the fact that nobody testified it was the murder weapon. But the DAs are up there, look at this, hatchet head. I don't get it. I don't know how you get away with that, but they did. Now, what makes this even more troubling is the fact that very shortly before the trial, the DA gets a letter from 2 Harvard Medical School professors, one of whom was a guy named Dr. David Williams, no relation, Cheever. Now there's a relation. His great-grandson is married to my wife's cousin, which I didn't know until a few months ago. This letter advises the DA that their opinion is that when they were taking a look at these skulls, they found in one of the cuts in the skull of Abby Borden over her right ear, they found an ornamental gilt deposit, G-I-L-T. And what that signified to them is that this was a new weapon. Because when hatchets were sold, they had a strip of ornamental gilt here for whatever reason. Probably to just make them look, make them look attractive. And do we have a cabaret license? This is foam rubber. I wouldn't throw real out. Anyway, the point of this is that whether it's true or not, because remember too, these skulls have been boiled and tossed around and everything. Presumably, you would have thought somebody would have seen this gilt deposit before these two doctors saw it. But that aside, they saw it, and it was their opinion that this was a brand new weapon. That was their opinion, and they laid it out very straightforwardly and very plainly in this letter to the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth never told the defense team about that. And both of those guys testified at this trial, including Dr. Cheever, and was not asked about that. That's a little unethical. I think it's a potentially big deal. They should have at least disclosed it. And the other thing I'll mention about the trial is there were two very, very critical evidence exclusions. You'll remember that I told you that Lizzie testified at the inquest. Her testimony was very contradictory. She was all, where were you? I was over here, I was over here, I was out in the back. She's all over the place. A lot of fodder there to trip somebody up in cross-examination should she testify at the trial. They wanted to read, that is, the Commonwealth wanted to read that inquest testimony. No. That was excluded. And the reason it was excluded was because her lawyer, she wanted her lawyer in there with her, and the judge did not allow that. So that was excluded. And also her attempt to buy cyanide, if that was actually her, at least they had evidence that it was her, that was also excluded. Closing arguments, Lizzie is invited by the judge to speak to the jury without being cross-examined. That was the custom at the time. And she stood up very slowly, and she looked at the jury, and she said, "I am innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me." And she sat down. That's all she said. And then Judge Dewey instructed the jury and says, in order to convict this woman, you have to find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have a strong indication that she probably did this, not enough, beyond a reasonable doubt. Less than an hour later, they said they had a verdict, and it turns out that she was not guilty. And it further turns out that they found her not guilty in about 10 minutes, but they hung around in the jury room because they didn't want to embarrass the Commonwealth. Courtroom filled up rapidly when everybody found out that there was a verdict on the way. When the verdict was read, the place exploded into cheers. People were beside themselves. And that euphoria, it spread from the courtroom out into the waiting crowd outside. Lizzie sank down into her seat and sobbed. The jurors lined up to shake her hand. She hid away in the judge's lobby for a while so that the crowd could die down a little bit. She finally caught the train back home to Fall River from New Bedford. And Fall River remained her home for the rest of her life. That is her very soon after the verdict. Now, despite the celebration that greeted her acquittal, Fall River society shunned her. That began when she sat in the pew that she leased at the Central Congregational Church. She was in there with Dr. Bowen and a few other people, and all the pews around her were empty. And she presumably sat through that service, got up, never went back to that church, never went back to any church. Now, she and her sister Emma owned the 2nd Street house until 1918, but very soon after this trial, indeed the following month, July 1893, they bought a house, 3-story house, 14-room house at then 7 French Street on the hill. Number 306 now, I believe. They have renumbered the streets in Fall River several times. Never found a will for Andrew Borden. Emma inherited everything and immediately split it with Lizzie. They bought this house. Lizzie called it Maplecroft. That was an addition she put on. That's what it looks like pretty much today. I think I took this a year or so ago. So that's Maplecroft. She named it Maplecroft, and you can't see it in this picture, but in the top step there it says Maplecroft. She had that emblazoned on the front step. Not quite a mansion, but it's close. It's mahogany paneled, richly appointed. At hame in my ain country. Scottish. On the third floor lived the maid, the housekeeper, and the driver of Lizzie's black Packard Phaeton. In 1905, Lizzie started calling herself Lizbeth A. Borden. Guy who lives around the corner from me has a 1925 Fall River City Directory, and that's what it says. 306, by that time it was French Street, 306 French Street, Lizbeth A. Borden. Now the interesting thing about this to me is that you see that guy at 294, that's next door, John T. Swift. That guy is the lawyer that Alice went to ask, what should I do with this information I have about Lizzie? So, Lizzie did have a circle of friends. She traveled to Providence, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. She loved to dine out. She loved to go to the theater. The favorite place she did go was Washington, where she believed she had real friends. And she would stay as long as a month in a suite in the luxury hotel called the Cochrane, which is at 14th and K Northwest. And what she loved to do is eat well at the Cochrane and then walk across the street to Franklin Square and feed the pigeons. She formed a close attachment with an actress named Nance O'Neill. The nature of that relationship has never been made clear. She also had dinner parties at Maplecroft with such theater folk as Nance O'Neill. These were probably pretty tame, but apparently they were enough to drive Emma from the house in 1905. Another factor might have been the frequent taunting and pranks from the neighborhood children. They really pretty much tortured this woman in this house. Did stuff like press the doorbell and then stick a pin in there so it continues ringing. You know, like you haven't done that. Emma, as I say, left the place in 1905. She finally settled in a house in Newmarket, New Hampshire. And so Lizzie now is alone in the staff, alone in the house with her staff, except for her Boston Terriers. And that one is Lizzie, that's Lizbeth there, 1916. And on her lap is Laddie Miller Borden. She also liked to go to picnics. There she is. That's a cane, not a rifle. But that is the Packard. And there's that. She's about 60 years old in this picture. And there she is, also in the back. This gentleman in the front row with the pointed ears is either Donald Stewart Borden or Royal Nelson Borden. Talking about the dog, he's right here. In 1919, she specified that her wake and her funeral be private. And she specified that the service would be conducted by an Episcopal minister. That was a slap at the Congregational Church. At the house, someone would read the poem Crossing the Bar. You might be familiar with that poem, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Also, a verse, the chapter in the Bible, John chapter 14. This is the verse or the chapter that contains the line, "In my Father's house are many mansions." And it occurred to me only yesterday that she could have changed that to, "In my mansion could fit many of my Father's house." Also the 23rd Psalm, not terribly original. And also to be sung the first and fourth verses of a song called My Ain Country. And she will remember, oh, that's another picnic picture. She's laughing in this one. There's the dog again, never without the dog. There's the Packard, really good picture of that. She had a spoon collection. At Hame in my own country, she loved that stuff. And so a woman named Vita Turner, who was a contralto, came in and sang it. She was paid, and she was told, don't tell anyone where you were and what you did. Goodbye. And she didn't for a long time. Lizzie also designated that she was to be laid at my father's feet, which is interesting because remember I told you they got their heads cut off? It's generally accepted that, although this is not universally accepted, but generally accepted that those skulls are at the feet of Andrew and Abby. So I don't know what, you know. During the spring of 1927, her health deteriorated. She had some gallbladder trouble. She went to the theater one last time. She saw a play called Pickwick at the Schubert Majestic Theater on Tremont Street in Boston. This is now the Cutler Majestic Theater owned by Emerson College. She died on June 1st, 1927. She was 66 years old. She died in Maplecroft of heart disease complicated by acute bronchitis. In her will, she made dozens of individual bequests. The largest single gift was $30,000 to the Animal Rescue League of Fall River. The day before she died, Emma, who was also in poor health, she was suffering from nephritis and what was then called senility, had fallen at her New Hampshire home. And she died 9 days later at the age of 76. The sisters had not spoken in 22 years. They are both buried with their mother, their father, their infant sister, and their stepmother in Oak Grove Cemetery on the hill in Fall River. That's the family monument. Lizbeth. She gave her one great ambition in life as I would give every cent I have in the world and in the streets if it could only be proved while I live that I did not kill my father and stepmother. But it never was. Lizzie Borden. Before anybody asks if I think she did it, probably. Beyond a reasonable doubt, no. The verdict was correct, in my view, given the evidence. Did she probably do it? Only because it's so hard to conceive of somebody else doing it. You'd either have to go in there twice or you'd have to stay in there. And of course, the defense at the trial tried to come up with a theory that whoever the killer was had killed Abby and then hidden in the closet down by the front door. Did that? Who knows? But evidence is all over the place.